Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today, I'd like to talk about two accidents in which the improper use of checklists was a factor. Now, one involved a commercial airliner, and the other a Cirrus SR20. Afterwards, I'll pass along suggestions on how to make better use of checklists when you fly. Also, we have audio from listener Ed Kelly, who talks about a recent encounter with icing. Back at episode 272, we talked about three recent accidents, two of which involved failure to follow standard operating procedures, and two that included spatial disorientation. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/272. And so that you don't miss next week's episode, use whatever app that you're listening to me right now. Take a moment and touch either the subscribe or the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free and you don't miss a show. And this is a listener-supported show, so if you've been listening for a while and have learned some new things from the show, I'd like to invite you now to become a member and join the club to support Aviation News Talk. There are many support levels from which you can choose, so pick one with which you're comfortable. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. Of course, we have a link for that in our show notes. This week in the news, pass rates on private check rides are down. You can apply to become an FAA controller, but you have just a few days left. And a pilot arrested for smuggling shows he had a good sense of humor. All this and more, and the news starts now. From generalaviationnews.com, pass rates on pilot practical tests trend down. And this, by the way, was written by a friend of the show, Jason Blair, who we've had on numerous times. He writes, the pass rates on practical tests for the initial issuing of pilot certificates, specifically private, commercial, and flight instructor certificates, went down in 2022 for the first time in the past few years. And it went down on all three certificates, noted officials with the Flight School Association of North America. Officials said in a recent association newsletter, quote, many in the training industry have felt over the past few months that the passing rate was declining, and now that we have the 2022 U.S. Civil Airman statistics, we can put data to that feeling. None of the pass rate decreases were overly large, but there is concern that this turn may really only be a measure of what's happened in the past year, officials continued. In the early parts of 2022, the most active airline hiring had not yet fully ramped up. As the year went on, a significant percentage of the acting CFI population in the U.S. was hired by airlines seeking to fill new hire classes for airline employment. As this happened, the core of CFIs in our job system turned over from those with more experience to those who were largely new at the job. The concern is that these less experienced CFIs may be a corollary, if not causal factor, in the drop in pass rates that have been reported by designated pilot examiners, or DPEs. While we can only speculate at the moment, this will be very worth tracking into the 2023 Certification Practice Association officials said. They add that the flight training industry has the opportunity to head off any further degradation in pilot training processes that result in lower pass rates by being proactive in the upcoming year. Hopefully we can do this and stop any further reduction in pass rates for pilot certification activities, they concluded. Let not this be the canary in the coal mine that we ignore. And from FAA.gov, BATC, FAA hiring air traffic controllers. The 2023 application window is open, but it's a short one. It lasts from just May 5th through May 8th of 2023. And they say, don't miss out. Prepare your application now. And then they say, am I eligible? Applicants must be, and they say, a U.S. citizen, registered for selective service if applicable, and that would be required for males born after December 31st, 1959, be younger than 31 years old before the closing date of the application period, have either 3 years of general work experience or 4 years of education leading to a bachelor's degree or a combination of both, speak English clearly enough to be understood over communications equipment, and be willing to relocate to an FAA facility based on agency staffing needs. For more information, go out to faa.gov/BE-ATC, and of course we'll have a link in the show notes. From generalaviationnews.com, free ForeFlight workshops take off. A series of free virtual workshops on ForeFlight launched on May 1st. The 90-minute interactive workshops will offer hands-on training on using ForeFlight for flight planning, weather, and in-flight navigation. The virtual workshops, led by Captain Brian Schiff, Mike Jesch, and Robert Metter will continue on the first Monday of each month through August 2023. You can register for the entire series, and the workshops will be recorded. To learn more, go to captainschiff.com/forflight. And also from flyingmag.com, ForeFlight acquires Cloud Ahoy. ForeFlight, a Boeing company, has announced its acquisition of Cloud Ahoy, a debriefing software provider. According to a post on the ForeFlight blog, the acquisition was completed in response to, quote, customer desire for more integrated digital solutions. ForeFlight, established in 2007, is one of the most widely used weather briefing and flight planning and management tools. Cloud Ahoy, created in 2011, provides post-flight debriefing, analytics, and flight operations quality assurance software products. Cloud Ahoy allows pilots to digitally record their flight and play it back to review their performance. The software is particularly useful in the training environment, where the emphasis is on meeting and exceeding the minimum standards for certification. Details of the merger have not been announced. From avweb.com, FAA program enables using off-the-shelf parts in certificated aircraft. EAA announced the unveiling of the FAA's Vintage Aircraft Replacement and Modification Article, or VARMA program. EAA has advocated many years for the initiative, which enables certain type certificated aircraft to use a number of non-flight critical, off-the-shelf parts without the need for new regulations, orders, or advisory circulars. Eligible aircraft include those weighing less than 12,500 pounds and built before 1980. According to EAA, quote, anyone who owns and operates vintage aircraft knows that finding parts can be a major challenge. The situation is especially frustrating when perfectly safe and functional alternatives are readily available, but can't be used because there's been no legal way to install them in a type certificate aircraft. With VARMA in place, some aspects of vintage aircraft ownership and operation are about to get simpler. EAA said the VARMA program empowers regular maintenance providers to validate that, quote, certain low-risk replacement parts are suitable for installation on an aircraft. Neither FAA-approved complex engineering analysis nor complex and time-consuming design and production approvals are required. EAA CEO and chairman of the board Jack Pelton said, this is great news for those of us who own and fly vintage aircraft. There could easily come a time when a classic airplane that would otherwise be grounded for want of a part that's no longer available will fly again thanks to the part substitution enabled by VARMA. The FAA definition of parts that fall under VARMA rules include those that would not, quote, prevent continued safe flight and landing. So safety-critical components are not subject to this program, though EAA pointed out that there are plenty of hard-to-find parts that meet VARMA's criteria. From GeneralAviationNews.com, unleaded gas on track to be at California airports by summer 2023. Well, that's just around the corner. Unleaded 100-octane aviation fuel should be available at 3 California airports as early as this summer, according to officials with GAMI, the General Aviation Modifications Incorporated. In an hour-long forum at 2023 Sun and Fun, presented by GAMI's George Brawley, he noted that if all goes well to plan, Reed Hillview Airport of Santa Clara County, Watsonville Municipal Airport, and Meadows Field Airport in Bakersfield will be the first airports in the country to offer GAMI's lead-free 100-octane FAA-approved avgas known as G100UL. A California FBO chain has also expressed interest in distributing the new fuel at its 13 locations, he noted. California is crying for this fuel, he said. The avgas situation at Reed Hillview Airport is critical because the sale of 100 low-lead has already been suspended there. As a sad result, he said, that a plane reportedly ran out of fuel and crashed when its owner attempted to fly from Reed Hillview to a nearby airport for a fill-up. The plane's fuel had been depleted by extended engine run-ups at a maintenance shop. After a 13-year effort and many roadblocks, GAMI finally received its all-inclusive STC in September 2022. During the Sun and Fun Forum, Brawley praised the efforts of the FAA certification staff in the Wichita office. He also cited help at critical junctures from now retired Senator James Inhofe and Mark Baker, president of AOPA. In order to buy and use the new environmentally friendly fuel, which appropriately enough is green in color, aircraft owners are required to purchase an STC from GAMI. The STC costs around $2 per horsepower, includes placards and a flight manual supplement. More than 500 STCs have been sold so far. As a drop-in fleet-wide avgas replacement, G100UL can be mixed with 100 low-lead in any ratio, and without any alteration to aircraft engines or airframes. GAMI is currently working with an experienced aviation fuel blender in Houston that can produce the patented formulation in railcar quantities by the end of June 2023. After the shipment of G100UL arrives in California, the fuel will be loaded into tanker trucks and delivered to individual airports. AvFuel, a global supplier of aviation fuel, helped GAMI fund the STC process over the past 6 years, but any qualified aviation fuel producer or blender can apply for a license to produce and distribute G100UL. That creates competition, said Brawley, who hopes to have nationwide distribution in place by 2026. It's a chicken and egg situation. Brawley reported that Cirrus confirmed his early experiments showing that GAMI's unleaded avgas produces a 4% improvement in brake horsepower at the same lean of peak fuel flow. In the example cited, G100UL produced almost 10 horsepower more than 100 low lead. The science works, he said. The tests done by Cirrus were an elegant experimental ratification of earlier test data. He was also quick to point out that having more energy available from G100UL makes up for the fact that it weighs slightly more than 100 low lead and is likely to cost more. During testing observed by FAA officials, detonation protection from using G100UL exceeded that of 100 low lead. In addition, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University helped GAMI conduct a successful 200-hour engine durability test using a relatively high-time 1,400-hour engine. Robinson Helicopter is also about to start its own independent evaluation of G100UL. Other tests have shown that GAMI avgas does not harm fuel tanks made of fiberglass and carbon fiber. Also, a batch of G100UL that had been stored in a drum for 12 years still met specifications, Brawley said. And you can learn more about G100UL at g100ul.com. From generalaviationnews.com, student pulls fuel mixture instead of carb heat. Now, this comes from a NASA ASRS report written by the CFI. He wrote, "The flight was for takeoff and landings in the traffic pattern. A beam of our landing point, the student adjusted power, put in 10 degrees of flaps, and turned carb heat on. I noticed the student then added throttle a few seconds later, but I observed no change in engine sound, felt power, or RPM. I took control of the Cessna 172 and added power and observed no change. I immediately turned toward the runway and checked the ignition switch, the carb heat, and fuel selector valve. At this point, I was convinced my engine had failed, and I requested priority handling. I was given landing clearance for runway XX. I continued my short approach to the runway and figured out that by pulsing the power, the engine would give me very small bursts of power. I continued to do this in order to extend my glide. The landing was normal. By continuing to pulse the power, I was able to taxi to the edge of the ramp, where the engine then shut off. After the engine shut off, I removed my hand from the throttle and observed the knob was out several inches toward lean. We checked our fuel quantity and observed the plane still had 14 gallons on board. I pushed the mixture knob into rich and attempted to restart the engine. It restarted and ran normally. My conclusion is that the student accidentally leaned the mixture while attempting to adjust carb heat, power, and flaps while abeam the landing point. Since I reached for the throttle when I observed the issue, my view of the mixture knob was obscured, and I failed to notice it in the lean position. Due to this and the limited time to troubleshoot from 1,000 feet AGL, I treated it as an engine failure and executed an immediate landing. In any future event, I will be sure to double-check the mixture in the event of an abnormal engine event. Additionally, I will stress the importance of adjusting the correct thing while performing the before-landing checklist. Also, I will stress the importance of verbalizing any abnormality that the student may observe so that the maximum amount of time possible is available to troubleshoot. And this happened to me just one time with a student at the San Martin airport. We were on downwind and that student pulled the mixture. Fortunately, I realized what had happened and I pushed it in very quickly and the engine restarted immediately. From generalaviationnews.com, Mooney pilot learns several lessons during flight into icing conditions. And this also comes from a NASA ASRS report written by the pilot. Now, these reports are anonymized by NASA, and so the airport names are replaced by letters like ZZ2. He writes, departed ZZ2 under VFR and a 4,100-foot ceiling with the intention to climb to flight level 230, while presumably still north of forecast icing south and east of ZZ1. This was all to occur before turning east on course, by then well above the forecast icing of between 6,000 and 20,000 feet in the area south and east of ZZ1. When I filed to overfly ZZZ, then ZZ3, ATC cleared a route to the south, which I rejected with a clearance delivery as too close to the airment boundaries. They instead agreed to have me overfly ZZ-4, then ZZZ-5, which likely made no difference in my overall judgment error and outcome. Climbing through 5,000, I noted light Rhine building on the Mooney M20's leading edges and windscreen. Pitot heat was on before becoming IMC, and I activated Weeping Wing, defrost, and windshield de-ice. At the same time, the autopilot had malfunction and not engaged either heading or navigation modes, and repeated cycling of its power toggle failed to achieve navigation capture. Further, I inadvertently extended the speed brakes while level at 6,000 with 2 brick hand movements when I noticed I found they had frozen extended and asymmetrically and could not be retracted. I asked ATC for an immediate climb above 10,000 feet, the reported tops, but they could not due to conflicting ZZZ-1 traffic. I then requested priority handling and asked for an immediate descent in nearest airport landing, which they gave me. With the brakes out, the windscreen obscured, and no autopilot to lean on, I nearly lost control. I focused on keeping wings level, small turns to maintain direction, and a gentle descent no more than 500 feet per minute. Upon breaking out at 2,500, I was in VMC and had an otherwise uneventful arrival at ZZZ-5. Tower cleared me to their runway XX, but runway X was straight ahead, and I queried them on final, and landing was approved any runway. After arrival at the FBO there was still rime ice on small areas of the leading edges, and the speed brakes, which eventually retracted as the ice melted. Lessons learned: icing forecasts are not geographically exact. Having FIKI or flight into known icing capability may not save one's life. Avoid rapid hand movements that could extend the speed brakes at a bad time. Delay departure until icing forecasts are well away from climb to cruise altitude. And later in the show, we'll have a recording by Patreon supporter Ed Kelly, who will talk about his recent encounter with icing. From FlyingMag.com, hot air balloon pilot charged in deadly accident. A pilot was charged with homicide following a deadly hot air balloon accident on April 1st in Mexico City that killed 2 passengers and injured another. The accident occurred during a sightseeing trip when the balloon's basket caught fire. Jose Nolasco, 50, and his wife, Ferverdian Burselli, 38, died in the fire, while their 13-year-old daughter, Regina, jumped more than 130 feet, suffering a broken arm and second-degree burns. Reports indicate that the pilot, Victor Guzman, fled the scene, telling authorities he didn't know what to do once the balloon caught fire. Guzman also suffered burn injuries from the incident. Guzman is now being held in pretrial detention, while the prosecutor's office has not determined any cause for the balloon to catch fire. While hot air balloon rides are popular, accidents remain a rare occurrence. According to the FAA's accident database, hot air balloons are the safest form of air travel. Since 1964, the NTSB has investigated 775 hot air balloon incidents in the U.S., of which only 70 involve fatalities. The U.S. has far fewer hot air balloon incidents each year than other countries such as Mexico and Japan. Mexico's regulatory environment could factor into the higher number of instances because of relatively lax safety standards. The most deadly hot air balloon accident occurred in 2013 in Luxor, Egypt, after the balloon caught fire and killed 19 tourists. And finally, from BusinessInsider.com, a pilot who tried to smuggle 4 people from Belgium to Britain in a private airplane was jailed for 7 years, but at least he has a sense of humor. A pilot once jailed for smuggling drugs on a light aircraft has been sentenced again, this time for trying to smuggle people. Richard Stiles, 53, was sentenced to 7 years, along with his fellow pilot and a taxi driver, for trafficking 3 men and a woman who were trying to evade immigration checks from Belgium to Britain. The UK's National Crime Agency said Stiles worked with the other pilot to rent a 6-seat Piper Seneca for $1,900. Investigators believe the men were in contact with an Albanian known as Tim Kay, who arranged for Stiles to meet his passengers in Belgium. When the plane landed at Northamptonshire, England on March 23rd, police were waiting. When Stiles was arrested, he joked with authorities, saying, "I normally get arrested for drugs, so it's a bit strange." He was previously convicted for attempting to smuggle ecstasy from Belgium in 2003 and used a plane to drop cannabis into Jersey in the Channel Islands the same year. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison in 2006, where he met his accomplice co-pilot. Jacques Beer of the National Crime Agency said Stiles was a career criminal who previously used his piloting skills to move consignments of drugs around Europe. On this occasion, he was offering a luxury end-to-end service, bringing people into the UK using a private plane. His comments to my officers show that he considered getting arrested nothing more than an occupational hazard. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And then we'll talk about 2 accidents that involve the improper use of checklists. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. First up, let's get to the good news. Congratulations to Martin Goodman. He's now a CFII, and I must say that teaching instruments is my favorite thing to do. So, Martin, I hope you have a great time doing that as well. And congratulations to patron supporter Bob Bacall. He says, I passed my commercial ASEL check ride this past week. Special shout out to Adam Lacamai at Pivotal Aviation at Spartan Downtown Airport and my DPE Randy Harrelson at Elberton Airport. And an obvious thanks to yourself as I listen to every episode and always walk away with a new learning experience. Thanks for all you do, Max. Congratulations to both of you. And if you have any good news you'd like to share, go ahead and send it to me by going out to aviationnewstalk.com. Click on Contact at the top of the page. And now here's a recording from patron supporter Ed Kelly talking about an icing encounter that he had recently.
Howdy, Max. Ed Kelly here. I wanted to drop you a note and say thank you. I think you may have saved my life. On April 10th, I was flying my Piper Saratoga home from the Bahamas. We took off from Marsh Harbor, and we're heading back home to Charleston. And there was a massive, massive thunderstorm from north to south, somewhere near Jacksonville, north of Ormond Beach, something like that. There was probably 100 miles or so in diameter. And as we were coming up on this thunderstorm, the controller, I was at 12,000 feet. The controller asked if I could climb to 13 for traffic separation. Okay, no problem. I do fly an unpressurized Saratoga, so 13, no problem. We're not going to hit 13.5 and likely going to be for a short time, so I took it. In the back of my mind, I thought to myself, I wonder what the icing level is. I thought it, and I pulled up my, on the 750, I've got Sirius XM weather, pulled it up, icing level was reported at 12,000, right where I was. And yet, even though the controller asked for the climb, and it was to help him out, he wanted traffic separation, and if I recall correctly, the heading I was on was like a 050. It was one of those, it could have been either odd or even, it was kind of a hit or miss depending on the crosswind. So I said 13, no problem. And I thought to myself, I'm not sure I should do this. And yet I said yes. I wanted to be agreeable. And so I said, sure, I can. So I took 13, started the climb. I've never interacted with ice before. I've been scared, absolutely scared of it. Between icing and stall spin on final, those are like my 2 biggest fears. And they're from listening to you. So thank you for teaching those things. So I was very aware, very, very hyper aware of the fact that I was in visible moisture climbing above the freezing level. I made a dumb choice. So I was looking at my wing, watching it like staring at the wing, watching the temperature probe at the top of the windscreen, and the white wing on the backdrop of a white cloud deck that was underneath me, and we were in and out of this thunderstorm that was all around us. So it was IMC. I couldn't really tell whether or not I was picking up ice. I was like, well, there's visible moisture. It doesn't look like it's freezing. And then I started seeing this sheet come over the window, over the windscreen. And I could see that the visible moisture was not moving quite as fast as it was earlier. And I was like, I bet that is starting to get hard. And so I'm looking at the temperature probe, looking out at the white wing, very difficult to tell. But at the very, very tip of the airplane, at the very tip of the wing, there's maybe a 8-inch section that's blue. And on that blue section, I could see the water moving past, rolling to the back, and then it stopped moving. And I thought, I'm picking up ice. So I went to pull the prop back because I was starting to get too fast. My prop the prop control would not move. I'm assuming the prop governor, which is obviously at the very front of the cowling, froze up. And so I was stuck at 2,200 RPM in a climb, and I wanted to descend and slow down. So I didn't ask permission. I let the controller know what I was doing. Keyed up the radio, said, I'm picking up ice, I'm descending. And he asked what kind of ice. And frankly, I didn't care at that moment. I was worried about descending and not getting over the VA. So I did. I just started descending. I was going back to 12, whether he liked it or otherwise. I let him know. And maybe 10 seconds later, he gave me the instruction to descend and maintain 12,000. And it was the most relieving thing to be able to move my prop mixture the prop control once we got down below, maybe it was like 11.6 or I'm sorry, 12.6 or 12.5, something like that. And I started seeing that the little piece of blue at the end of the wing the water started moving again, and that sheet on the windshield moved off, and the panic, the heartbeat, my thighs sort of shaking, and I was like, I was so close to dying right there. I chose not to be pilot in command in that moment. I for whatever reason, I said, sure, controller, I'll take 13. And I knew that was a dumb choice. And yet in the moment, it felt like maybe it was the right choice. I hope that this story can help perhaps save someone else. But Max, it was the fact that you talk about icing and have so many times that I was able to pay such close attention to what the airplane was doing while I was in this potential icing situation, which it should have been known icing really. And I was very conscious of the autopilot, knowing that the autopilot can trick me. So I had my hand on the trim wheel to know if the autopilot was trimming, in case the tail plane was about to stall, or if I was picking up ice on the tail, which I obviously couldn't have seen. So thank you very much for literally saving my life. And I hope that this can help someone else to understand icing is actually no joke. Oh, and to top it all off, my true airspeed during that maybe 40 seconds or so as this all happened, true airspeed went from 165 to 115. So I lost an immense amount of power. And I'm not sure if I got ice somewhere else, like in the air intake or some, if it was drag on the airplane, or if it was actual engine power that I lost. But I knew that if I kept that climb going, and I was at about 12.8 or 9, I think at the time, I wouldn't have stayed in the air. That airplane would have just stalled right there. So hopefully that's helpful. Have a great day, sir.
Ed, thanks so much for sharing your story, and I'm happy you feel that listening to Aviation News Talk was a lifesaver for you. Now, I think we as humans are just programmed evolutionarily to want to help other people. And when a controller asks you if you can do something, unfortunately, our knee-jerk reaction is, yes, of course I'll do what you're asking me to do, even if in the back of our mind we're thinking, I'm not sure this is a good idea. But once having accepted the climb and realizing that it was a bad idea, Ed, you did the right thing, which was to tell the controller that you were picking up ice and that you were starting to send down out of the ice. Now, yes, ideally, one should ask the controller first, but that's not always convenient, especially if the frequency is busy. If that's the case, you can squawk 7700 and start your way down before telling the controller. Now, alarms will go off when you dial 7700 to the transponder, so the controller will notice immediately and call you. They'll also start moving other aircraft out of the way to accommodate you. Now, instrument pilots know that you must follow any clearance you've been assigned, but the rulebook says that if you're having an emergency, that rule no longer applies. So if you have to deviate from a clearance and it's time critical that you start deviating from that clearance, just declare an emergency. Now, it's rare that you'd have to do that, as usually we have time to ask for permission or to tell the controller that we urgently need to deviate from our clearance now. But as a pilot, you have the authority to do whatever you need to do to remain safe. And that authority comes from no less than 91.3b, which says, in an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot in command may deviate from any rule of this part to the extent required to meet that emergency. And I've said before that that is my favorite FAR, because it says that the FAA trusts us enough to do whatever it is we have to do to save ourselves in an emergency. And they explicitly give us permission to do that. So Ed, good job, and thanks for sharing your story. And if you want to know more about icing, I have some suggestions. The free options are that you can listen to 3 past episodes of Aviation News Talk. Episode 110 was an interview with Dr. Fred Reamer about carburetor icing and structural icing, and where icing is most prevalent in the U.S., and the clouds that are most likely to have ice. And in episode 111, I talked about an SR20 icing accident that killed a client of mine. And in episode 227, I talked about a near-fatal icing incident that I had 30 years ago in a Cessna 182 while flying my first long trip that I'd ever taken, and that was from Scottsdale, Arizona to Palo Alto, California. And you can find these episodes at aviationnewstalk.com/110/111 and /227. There's also another excellent resource which I highly recommend to you, regardless of what type of aircraft you fly. However, it will cost you $50, which of course is a pretty small price to pay for something that might save your life. And that's the Icing Awareness course produced by Cirrus, which you can find online at cirrusapproach.com. Now, Cirrus is so serious about the value of training that the limitation sections of the POH on FICI, that is Flight into Known Icing, aircraft require that pilots must have taken that icing awareness course within the prior 24 months before operating the aircraft in icing conditions. So it's actually illegal to fly a FICI Cirrus into known icing conditions unless the PIC completes that course every 2 years. And I just took it again earlier this week, as one of my flights a couple of days ago was in an SR-22T, and I knew there was a chance we might encounter ice. The course talks about icing in general, and it also talks about the specifics of the FICI system on Cirrus aircraft. By the way, if you fly a Cirrus aircraft with the older non-FICI certified version of the TKS anti-icing system, you are not required to take this course. But if I could wave a magic wand, I would require pilots of these older non-FICI TKS systems to take that course, because you'll learn so much, and you'll probably figure out that you should never, ever purposely plan to fly into known icing with any non-FICI system. Ed, thank you again for your recording. And if you have a story you'd like to share, go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page to send me an email, and I'll tell you how you can send me a longer recording like Ed did. Or to send a recording of 90 seconds or less, go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Listener Questions, where you can use our SpeakPipe app to create a recording right from your phone. Now here's an email from Mega Supporter Rob Parisian, and he said, "Hello, Max. I was flying my 182 in light rain yesterday in IMC, and I think that the propeller started making a whining sound, high-pitched and almost musical. Is this a common occurrence? I have not been able to find anything written about it yet. Cheers, Rob." Well, Rob, I don't know. If I've encountered this, I don't remember it. So I'm going to put this out to our audience. We have a lot of smart people here who've done thousands of hours of flying. Has anybody else encountered this? If you have, please send me a note. And again, aviationnewstalk.com. Click on Contact at the top of the page to let me know, and we'll pass that information along to you and Rob. And now let me tell you a little bit about what I've been up to. It's been over 2 weeks since the last episode, and I had a couple of emails asking if everything was okay. And the answer is yes, it's just that I've been extremely busy. I recorded episode 272 from my hotel room in Knoxville, which was at the beginning of an 8-day trip flying around the country with a new VisionJet owner to help him get the hours he needed for insurance purposes. Now, I've worked with over a dozen new VisionJet owners, and this trip was very different, as on the second leg of the first day of the trip, we hit what I believe was a seagull as we departed the New Orleans Lakefront Airport. Now, I saw the bird at the time and thought that we had missed it and didn't think anything more about it. But after we landed, the owner found the remains of the bird on the left wing of the airplane, and there was also a puncture in the de-icing boot in the left wing. Well, this led to a series of phone calls and other events that led us to staying on the ground for nearly 3 days in Austin, Texas. So we didn't get to make it to many of the places we'd planned to go, including the Bahamas, which would have been a fun stop. A week later, I got home back late on a Sunday night and then immediately jumped back into giving flight instruction on Monday at my home airport in Palo Alto, California. And I had an extraordinarily heavy schedule that week, probably because clients who were unable to fly with me the prior week when I was teaching in the jet signed up on my schedule for the next week. And that's why there was no new episode last week. Sometimes when I have a busy flight schedule, there's just not enough hours in the week to get a new episode out. But I do my best. I also wanted to share that I passed my second-class medical again last week. I always approach my FAA medical with just a little bit of trepidation, as I'm sure there will come a time, hopefully in the far distant future, when I don't pass the medical and potentially have to stop flying. But I also went into the medical with a lot of preparation and forethought. I'd picked up a few pounds since my last medical, so in the past 3 months I stepped up my exercise, which for me is mostly walking once or twice a day, sometimes QAing these episodes to listen for any errors that I have in them. And I shed 10 pounds over the past 3 months. Now that helps a little bit with my high blood pressure. I've been on blood pressure medication for maybe 8 years. And I know that my FAA doctor requires a letter from my primary care physician that states that my blood pressure is under control, and that letter has to include the results of a visit within the prior 90 days. So I scheduled a visit with my primary care physician ahead of time. But this time I had one more thing to deal with, and that is around last September, I noticed that I had tinnitus, which is a ringing in your ears. And you might be thinking, I thought it was tinnitus. And I wasn't sure, so I looked it up. The suffix itis means inflammation, and this is not an inflammation of the ear. And tinnitus does not end in itis. It ends in itus, so it's tinnitus. Regardless, I checked with AOPA and they said, yes, the FAA doctor for my medical would want a letter from my primary care physician about that too. So I scheduled a hearing test a few weeks ago before the medical, and the results were not too surprising. They showed that I have some hearing loss for high frequencies starting at around 3,000 hertz in both ears. I already knew that, as when I got the Lightspeed Delta Zulu headset, it allows you to run a hearing test so that you can configure the headset to equalize the sound that you hear over a wide range of audio frequencies. The graph from that test showed that the headset needed to boost both the low frequencies, but especially the high frequencies for me. And as I've mentioned before, when I use that headset, I do find a slight improvement in my ability to hear ATC instructions. And if you're thinking about maybe buying a headset from Lightspeed, please start your research by using one of the links in our show notes, which you can find in whatever app that you're listening to now, or you can find them by going out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com/273. Because if you use one of those links to make your visit to the Lightspeed website and you later decide to buy a headset, Lightspeed will pay us a referral fee to help support this show, which I greatly appreciate. But the best thing about the hearing test was that the tinnitus was at the lowest level, and it doesn't affect my ability to get things done. I do hear it almost all the time, most of the time as I'm getting ready to go to sleep. But most of the time when I'm focused on a task, like right now working on a podcast, I don't even notice it, which is great. Now, I did learn something really interesting from the doctor of audiology that I went to for the hearing test, something I hadn't heard before, which is that there are some studies out which show that there may be links between hearing loss and dementia, which I thought was wild. And the link is that as you lose your ability to hear at certain frequencies, those cells in the brain are no longer stimulated, and they tend, I guess, to atrophy over time. So what I learned is that even if you don't have a compelling, strong, immediate need for a hearing aid, there may be some benefits to getting a hearing aid a little bit before you absolutely need one, just to keep those brain cells stimulated. I was told for the amount of hearing loss that I have, some people get hearing aids, some people don't, and it really depends upon what type of activities you're doing. So, for example, if I were holding meetings in restaurants where it's noisy and hard to hear, I might need one, but I don't. Usually I'm working with people one-on-one, and it's fairly easy for me to hear what they're saying. So anyway, really interesting. If you're getting to be an older person like me and you have some hearing loss, you may want to have it checked out. Also, in preparation for the FAA medical, I saw an ophthalmologist and had the prescription for my contacts updated. And as a result, I find that I now need to use my reading glasses a little bit more in the cockpit. Anyway, to net it all out, my suggestion is that if you have an FAA medical coming up soon, do some preparation in advance so that everything goes smoothly. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Darren, who says, "Hi Max, I'm a long-term listener who just signed up to support you through Patreon. I'm a CFI based at KBED, Bedford, Mass, and always listen to your podcast on my drive to the airport, so I have some new advice, ideas, improvements to share with my students that day. My most recent one being taking additional time in winter to allow the fuel to vaporize after priming. I've literally demonstrated the efficacy of that advice many times over the last few weeks. Thanks again for your valuable insight over the years, Darren." Well, Darren, thanks so much for signing up to support the show and for letting me know that you're finding it helpful. And let me tell you a little bit about these other people who have just signed up to support the show. We have 3 new mega supporters. These are folks who donate $50 a month or more. And they include Kimberly Coons, Eric Edward Himes, and William Kinney. And I'll tell you more about each of them in a future episode. Also, thanks to these people who signed up at various levels. At the $8 a month level, we have Donald Douglas. Sean Carbonell edited up to $20 a month. Other $20 a month supporters include Mike W., Sanjay Kalgachi, Cliff Foray, and Daryl Contreras. And I'd like to invite you to do what these people have done. Take the 2 or 3 minutes that it takes to sign up and support the show. If you've been listening for a while and get value from the show, please do that. It's easy to do. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, because you're all awesome listeners, where you can sign up to make a monthly donation, or you can also donate via PayPal, either a monthly donation or a one-time donation by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Coming up next, we're going to talk about some checklist catastrophes, 2 accidents in which the improper use of checklist was a factor. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now I'd like to talk about 2 accidents in which the improper use of checklist was a factor. One involved a commercial airliner and the other a Cirrus SR20. Now, after we talk about the accidents, I'll pass along some suggestions on how to make better use of checklists when you fly. Now, one thing I observe as a CFI is that as pilots become more experienced, some of them start to rely less on checklists, often to their own detriment. It's almost as if some pilots feel like, hey, I have, pick a number, let's say 500 hours of flying experience, and I'm now so good that I don't need to use the checklist. Or another variation might be, hey, checklists are important for student pilots when you're learning to fly, but I'm now so good at flying, I no longer have to rely on checklists. And if you were to extend that thinking to its logical conclusion, well, you'd conclude that high-time airline pilots don't need to use checklists because they're really good at flying. And yet, the culture of airline flying is that pilots are to rely heavily on checklists because even really experienced pilots still make mistakes when they don't use checklists or they don't use a checklist properly. Which brings us to our first accident, the commercial airliner accident, which arguably had 2 very experienced pilots on board. This involved Spanair Flight 5022. The following comes from Wikipedia. Spanair Flight 5022 was a scheduled domestic passenger flight from Barcelona El Prat Airport to Gran Canaria Airport, Spain, via Madrid Airport that crashed just after takeoff from runway 36 left at Madrid Airport at 2:24 p.m. local on August 20th, 2008. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas MD-82. Of the 172 passengers and crew on board, 154 died and 18 survived. 59 minutes before the flight's second attempted takeoff, the pilots had abandoned their first attempt to depart because of excessive temperatures in the ram air temperature or RAT probe, RAT. The aircraft was taken to a parking area where maintenance workers deactivated the RAT probe's heater. The aircraft was permitted to fly with an inoperable RAT probe heater because icing was not expected during the flight. It was after this maintenance, during the second takeoff attempt, that the accident occurred. The accident occurred due to the pilot's failure to deploy the flaps and slats as required for takeoff. Without use of these high-lift devices, the wings could not generate enough lift to keep the aircraft airborne. The MD-80 has a warning system, the Takeoff Warning System, or TOWS, T-O-W-S, which should have alerted the pilots that the aircraft was not correctly configured for takeoff. However, the warning did not sound, and the pilots continued with the attempt. As the aircraft took off, it stalled and impacted the terrain right of the runway strip, disintegrating and bursting into flames. Just 3 seconds after liftoff, the aircraft started shaking and banking to both sides. The stall warning horn activated as well as the synthetic voice. The first officer called out in a questioning tone, "Engine failure?" and reduced power on both engines, specifically on the right one, increasing the bank angle to the right to 32 degrees. Immediately after this, he pushed the engines to their full power, and the pitch increased to 18 degrees. The aircraft impacted the ground just right of the runway with its tail section first, then its right wingtip and its right engine. The final report concluded that the crash was caused by an attempt to take off with the flaps and slats retracted, which constituted an improper configuration, and noted that safeguards that should have prevented the crash failed to do so. The cockpit recordings revealed that the pilots omitted the set and check the flap, slat, lever, and lights item in the after-start checklist. In the takeoff imminent verification checklist, the co-pilot had simply repeated the correct flap and slat position values without actually checking them. All 3 safety barriers provided to avoid the takeoff in an inappropriate configuration were defeated: the configuration checklist, the confirm and verify checklist, and the takeoff warning system tows. The report also made a number of safety recommendations intended to prevent accidents like this from happening again. In the final report, the cause of the accident was listed as: the crew lost control of the accident as a result of a stall immediately after takeoff, which was caused by an incorrect configuration for takeoff, i.e. not deploying the flaps and slats following a series of errors and omissions, coupled with the absence of any warning of the incorrect configuration. The crew did not recognize the indications of stall and did not correct the situation after takeoff, and by momentarily retarding engine power and increasing the pitch angle, brought the aircraft closer to a stall condition. The crew did not detect the configuration error because they did not properly use checklists to select and check the position of the flaps and slats during flight preparation. Specifically, they failed to select the flaps slats lever during the corresponding step in the after-start checklist. They did not cross-check the position of the lever and the state of the flaps slaps indicator lights during the after-start checklist. They omitted the flaps slats check on the takeoff briefing taxi checklist. No inspection of the flaps and slats was carried out in execution of the final items step of the takeoff imminent checklist. Contributing factors were the absence of any warning of the incorrect takeoff configuration because the tows system did not work. It was not possible to determine conclusively why tows did not work. Also, inadequate crew resource management, or CRM, which did not prevent the deviation from procedures and omissions in flight preparation. And now let me just talk a little bit about this accident. Arguably, the accident would not have occurred if there hadn't been a problem with the rat probe during the first takeoff. The flaps and slats were set correctly for that first takeoff, but the crew retracted the flaps and slats when they taxied back for maintenance. Often accidents occur when something interrupts or distracts a pilot. Now in this case, the return for maintenance interrupted the crew's normal procedure for takeoff. And unfortunately, when they returned to take off a second time, they failed to follow all of the procedures required for reconfiguring the aircraft for that second takeoff. Part of the probable cause said no visual inspection of the flaps and slats was carried out. And I want to mention that I really like the Cirrus aircraft checklist because as part of their before takeoff checklist, it says flaps, 50% set and check. Yet frequently I see pilots just do the 50% set portion of the checklist and not do the check portion of the checklist, which is very easy to do by looking out the window and verifying that the flaps are actually in the 50% position. And occasionally a pilot will ask me why they have to look out the window and check the flaps. And I explain that it's possible for flaps to not match the switch setting. For example, my very first private student did her check ride in a Cessna 152, and when she raised the flaps after a touch and go, the flaps remained in the full flaps down position. And on several occasions over the last 17 years that I've been teaching in Cirrus aircraft, I've been in an aircraft where a relay has failed and the flaps no longer match the flap setting position that's been set. So follow your checklist carefully and do verify things such as flap settings by visually looking out the window. Now let's talk about another accident that's quite different, but which also was caused by the poor use of checklists. This was an SR-22 crash that occurred in West Virginia in 2014. Fortunately, the pilot suffered only minor injuries after pulling the parachute at a fairly low altitude. Here's what the final NTSB report said. On January 4th, 2014, about 5:35 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a Cirrus SR20 November 450 Tango X-ray was substantially damaged after the pilot deployed the Cirrus Airplane Parachute System, or CAPS, and impacted a motor vehicle and then terrain in Buchanan, West Virginia. The private pilot received minor injuries. The driver of the motor vehicle was not injured. The flight departed from Donegal Springs Air Park, November 71, in Marietta, Pennsylvania, about 2:05 p.m., destined for Upshur County Regional Airport, Whiskey 22, in Buchanan, West Virginia. VMC conditions prevailed. About 10 miles from W-22, the pilot called in on the Unicom frequency and verified the weather conditions. He was advised that there were no aircraft in the traffic pattern, so he opted for a straight-in approach to runway 29. About 5 miles from touchdown, he was at an approach speed of approximately 100 knots. He performed his pre-landing checklist. Both fuel tanks had approximately 25 gallons of fuel in them, and he verified that the fuel selector was on the fullest tank. He verified then that the fuel boost pump was on, lowered the wing flaps to 50%, and set the mixture to about 60%. He then made a final approach call around 4 miles from touchdown and verified the airport conditions on Unicom once again. Approximately 3 miles from the threshold of runway 29, at 400 to 500 feet above ground level, he increased throttle to compensate for the normal airspeed loss on final approach. To his surprise, nothing happened. He was expecting to hear a pitch change, feel a subtle change in vibration, and see his airspeed stabilize, but none of those events occurred. He, quote, moved his hand in a manner to manipulate both throttle and mixture at the same time and increase both to maximum. Again, no response in engine noise, vibration, or gain in airspeed occurred. The indicated airspeed had now decayed to below 80 knots. Knowing that he was just at or just below the published minimums for the Cirrus CAPS parachute deployment, he deployed it by pulling the red T-handle with his right hand while maintaining control of the aircraft with his left hand. He then transmitted a Mayday call over the radio. After CAPS was deployed, he tightened his restraint prior to impact. After impact, he shut down the aircraft's systems and exited the airplane. Data from the aircraft's MFD display showed that the airplane performed a normal takeoff and climb. It then entered a slower-than-normal cruise flight for the first portion of the recording. During the first portion of the cruise flight, between 3:24 and 3:59 p.m., the engine was at a low-power setting, with a recording showing an average of around 2,000 RPM. At 3:59 p.m., the airplane began a series of high-performance 360-degree turns. During this time, the pilot utilized various higher power settings, which resulted in higher RPM recordings. The pilot performed 8 360-degree turns. During the 8 360-degree turns, recorded vertical acceleration showed an average of about 2 Gs during most maneuvers. And by the way, let me just insert here. When you're at a 60-degree bank, if you're level in a turn, that's when you're pulling 2 Gs. So these were very steep turns. During the 6th and 7th 360-degree turns, the airplane reached about 70 degrees of bank. During the 8th 360-degree turn, vertical acceleration was recorded at a peak of approximately 3.3 Gs. During this turn, the airplane reached nearly 80 degrees of bank. At approximately 4:47 p.m., the pilot performed an aileron roll to the left. The airplane entered this maneuver from approximately a level altitude. During the maneuver, the airplane experienced about 2.5 positive Gs and 0.5 negative Gs. As the airplane completed the roll, the pitch became close to minus 30 degrees and the RPM was reduced to under 2,000 RPM. As the airplane stabilized, the RPM returned to about 2,500 RPM. The loss of altitude during this maneuver was about 900 feet. At approximately 4:51 p.m., the pilot performed a second roll to the right. The airplane entered this maneuver from a positive pitch attitude of about 19 degrees while pulling approximately 2.7 Gs. During the roll, the airplane experienced about 2.5 positive Gs and 0.5 negative Gs. As the pilot completed the maneuver, a high-performance 360-degree turn was immediately entered to the left. During this turn, vertical acceleration averaged about 2 Gs. The flight continued with a low RPM setting of about 2,000 RPM and a recorded airspeed of about 100 knots. During this last portion of cruise flight, the altitude varied between 6,000 and 7,000 feet. The airplane began to descend about 5:30 p.m. The RPM initially increased slightly during the descent, but later decreased to under 2,000 RPM for the remainder of the flight. The aircraft continued to descend until about 5:34 p.m., when the CAPS was deployed, which caused excursions in pitch and roll among other flight parameters. At the time of CAPS deployment, pressure altitude indicated 1,928 feet. Review of recorded engine parameters revealed that during the entire flight, engine RPM, oil pressure, fuel flow, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature, or CHT, and exhaust gas temperature, EGT, appeared to respond nominally when viewed in relation to each other during the cruise portion of the flight. Around 4:51 p.m., there was a brief but rapid drop in recorded oil pressure to 32 psi. This occurred during the negative G portion of the second aileron roll. The flight continued normally until the airplane began to descend for landing. Recorded data showed manifold pressure was reduced as well as fuel flow. 2 distinct drops in EGT were noted just prior to CAPS activation. Review of CAPS data revealed that the CAPS activated on the airplane approximately 0.76 miles from the threshold of runway 29. Indicated airspeed at the time of deployment was about 82 knots, and the airplane was in a generally wings level attitude. True altitude at the time of deployment was approximately 2,048 feet above mean sea level. Ground elevation at the approximate location of activation was 1,411 feet MSL. CAPS deployment height was approximately 637 feet above ground level. During examination of the airplane, the flaps were found fully extended, which was the correct configuration for landing. The throttle was found in the max position. However, the mixture control was found in a position about 2 inches forward of the idle cutoff position, which was consistent with a cruise setting and indicated that it was not in the maximum position as reported by the pilot. Recorded data showed that during the descent, both a reduction in the manifold pressure and fuel flow occurred, and that subsequently a distinct reduction in exhaust gas temperatures for all 6 cylinders occurred, corroborating that the mixture control was not advanced to maximum for the descent and landing. This information would have been available to the pilot on the airplane's display system and would have provided him sufficient information to note that his improper positioning of the mixture control was causing the loss of engine power. During the post-accident engine test run, the throttle was advanced and retarded multiple times with no hesitation or stumbling noted. A magneto check was also performed with minimal drop on either mag. The engine was then set to about 1,800 RPM to simulate an approach to landing, and the mixture control was moved to its as-found position. When the throttle was advanced, the engine stumbled and would not respond when the RPM was increased. Given this evidence, it's likely that the pilot's failure to move the mixture lever to the forward position during the approach to landing led to the reduction in engine power. During the wreckage examination, the airplane's quick reference checklist was discovered to have been out of reach of the pilot in the seat back pocket of the back of the pilot's seat. An electronic set of checklists was available on the MFD, though, should the pilot have chosen to use them. During post-accident interviews, however, the pilot did not indicate that he had used them and advised that he did not review the landing checklist, stating that, quote, "I know it by heart." When asked if he had the Cirrus POH, he stated that it was in the cargo compartment storage area, which, by the way, is so far behind the pilot that you could not reach it from inside the airplane. According to the airplane manufacturer, engine manufacturer, and FAA guidance, during descent, the mixture was required to be adjusted for smooth engine operation, and before landing, the mixture control was required to be in the full reach position. If the pilot had referenced the landing checklist on paper or on the MFD or manuals, he might have recognized the reason the engine was non-responsive and moved the fuel control mixture to the proper position for landing and prevented the loss of engine power. Probable cause: the pilot's improper in-flight fuel mixture management and failure to use the appropriate checklist or manuals during approach to landing, which resulted in a loss of engine power. And I'd like to add a note, in case you didn't catch it, the pilot was performing aerobatics in his Cirrus while he was in cruise. Now, that is a violation of the FARs, as the Cirrus is not certified in the aerobatic category. So while the aerobatics weren't directly responsible for this accident, they speak volumes about this pilot who illegally performed aerobatics in an airplane not certified for aerobatics. So this pilot was also so good that he didn't need to use checklist and never needed to refer to the POH, which was in the baggage compartment. And if you think about this pilot's behavior, It's pretty easy to identify a couple of the FAA's hazardous attitudes. Now let's talk about a few tips for improving your use of checklists. One of the best ways to improve your use of checklists and to motivate you to use them every time is if you create your own version of the checklist for the aircraft you fly most frequently. Now, I mentioned in a recent episode that I've taken a few helicopter lessons, and after the first one or two lessons, I created my own version of the startup checklist for the Robinson R44. Why? Because I found that I was making mistakes using the POH version of the checklist. I didn't make a lot of changes, but the few that I did helped shape my behavior so that I began performing better when starting up the helicopter. Now, here are a couple of the simple changes I made. One of the first items in the POH checklist reads, cyclic collection friction ... off. Now, the friction lock on the collective is out of sight, located down low next to the left side of my seat. And it wasn't at all intuitive to me that moving the friction lock forward unlocks it and sliding it back puts the friction lock back on. So in my checklist now it says cyclic collective ... friction off, and then in parentheses, forward. Seeing it written that way in the checklist saves me time, and I say the word forward, which has reinforced for me the correct direction for moving the collection friction lock. Later in the checklist, the POH says cyclic ... neutral friction on. But I had a bad habit of turning the cyclic friction too tightly when I turned it on. So in my checklist, it now says cyclic ... neutral friction on finger tight. And I actually say aloud finger tight, which reinforces that I shouldn't be cranking that knob down so tightly. And here's an example that might be more relevant to your flying. If you're flying an aircraft with a piston engine that uses 100 low lead, you probably know that for the last few decades, pilots have been encouraged to lean the mixture whenever we're on the ground to reduce the fouling of spark plugs by the lead in the fuel. Yet I have never seen an aircraft checklist that says lean the mixture when you're on the ground. And so I'm often reminding pilots to lean the mixture. And if you fly some models of Cirrus, you might have encountered this. The after landing checklist says to turn the boost pump off. Oddly, the shutdown checklist includes the same step, though if we all followed checklists carefully, that step would only need to be in one of those two checklists. But here's the problem. On a number of occasions, I've seen people turn the boost pump off after landing, and almost immediately afterwards, the engine has quit. In one case, a pilot turned the boost pump off immediately after landing while we were still on the runway, and the engine quit while we were still on the runway at night after the tower had closed. Now, having the engine quit wouldn't be such a big deal if we could get it to restart, but often it doesn't. And on a number of occasions, I've had to get airport ops to tow the aircraft back to parking. In the case of the night landing, I ended up pushing the aircraft myself while the pilot manipulated the brakes to get the plane off the runway before some other aircraft landed and ran into us. Now, this is a perfect example of why you should consider creating your own checklist. In this case, for the after-landing checklist, consider removing the step that says to turn off the boost pump and add a step that says to lean the mixture. And you might think, oh, I don't need to do that. I'll remember those steps. And yet, when you use a checklist, there will be times when you follow the checklist religiously and forget to add in other little things that you think you'll remember to add. Here's another tip for improving your use of checklist. Don't fall into the trap of believing that you're now so experienced a pilot that you don't need to use the checklist. The NTSB database is full of experienced pilots who had accidents because they didn't follow the checklist. For example, I mentioned in a recent episode a pilot I flew with who didn't use the checklist for shutting down the aircraft. Instead, he did it from memory. And to shut down the engine, instead of pulling the mixture back, he turned off the mag key instead. That, of course, will leave unburned fuel in the engine and increase the chance of having a hot prop. His explanation? That he had already started thinking about work, which is where he was going after our flight lesson. And in the SR20 accident that we just talked about a few minutes ago, that pilot had a very cavalier attitude toward checklists, as his checklist was out of reach, but he said, I know it by heart. Well, he may have known it by heart, but he didn't follow it, and the engine quit short of the airport because he failed to move the mixture to the full rich position. There is a fallacy in believing that you don't need to use checklists because you know the checklist so well. And that is that you are human, and humans make mistakes. And while you may indeed know a checklist by heart when you're fresh and relaxed and at the top of your game, what about when you're tired or distracted by something or someone in the cockpit? What if you're stressed because the weather is poor? Do you really think that you will always correctly remember every step on the checklist and will never make a mistake? Well, of course you will, because you're human. So commit yourself to using your checklist every time. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to pull out the checklist every time. For example, for certain checklists, you might instead use a flow checklist, where you move your hand in a specific pattern around the cockpit and make the required changes to the controls as your hand passes by them. Ideally, after you've done a flow, you'll look at the checklist to verify that you did everything during the flow. And finally, checklists are not just for less experienced pilots. They are for all of us, regardless of how much experience we have. And the origin of aviation checklists can be traced back to the early days of aviation, when pilots had to rely on their memory and handwritten notes. However, as aviation technology became more complex and aircraft became larger, the need for a standardized checklist became more important. Now, one tragic event that played a role in the development of checklists was the crash of the Boeing Model 299 in 1935. The Model 299 was a new bomber designed by Boeing, which was expected to revolutionize the U.S. Air Force. However, during a test flight, the aircraft crashed, killing 2 crew members. The investigation revealed that the pilots had forgotten to remove a control lock, which led to the crash. Afterwards, Boeing implemented a standardized checklist for all of their aircraft, which became known as the Boeing checklist. And that crash led to the widespread adoption of checklists across our industry. So please use your checklist all the time and consider creating your own checklist for the aircraft that you fly most frequently. And now let me mention our mega supporters. These are the folks who donate more than $50 a month. Take a listen, see if you know any of these people, and if you do, the next time you run into them, thank them for supporting the show. First up, Kevin Hendrickson. Roy Williams, he's a Vision Jet owner in Southern California. He runs ASP Home Health, which provides in-home nursing services in Southern California and trains family members to become nurses so they can provide their own in-home health care. Tyson Weiss, co-founder and CEO of 4Flight, which is a very popular EFB app. Dylan Caldwell, he's a senior AME with offices in Naples and Pompano Beach, Florida. And teenagers 17 and under do not pay for flight physicals. So if you need a basic med, first, second, or third class physical, contact him at aviatorsclinic.com, and in his spare time he tows gliders. Kent Mazzia, he and his wife Misty own a 2007 Cirrus at the Alpine Air Park in Wyoming and have a passion for helping others by flying volunteer missions for Angel Flight. Jonathan Weisswasser, he's a CFI, he's built an RV-8 and now flies a Meridian. Matt Souza, he's a private pilot flying a 172 out of Chicago Executive. Tim Delaney, who's happily retired in Eagle, Idaho. He flies a Turbo SR20 out of the Nampa Airport. Stephen Elop flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's now the CEO of Digital.ai, a company focused on enterprise agile software development tools. Mike Williams, he's an executive with MTSI, a leader in flight tests and unmanned system support. Seth Lake, he's DPE giving check rides in Arkansas. You can find out more about him or schedule a check ride at vsl.aero. Rick Miller, he's now teaching full-time in the Cincinnati area, both out of the Lunken Flight Training Center and with private owners of Pipers, Cessnas, Beechcrafts, and Cicadas. Justin Winter, he brokers real estate on Lake Kiwi, South Carolina, and flies a 2019 SR22. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation, they have a pair of Cessna T240 aircraft and a 2021 Piper M350. Jim Goldfuss, he's a CFI II instructing at Long Island Aviators at Republic Airport on Long Island in New York. He also provides simulator instruction in a Redbird to supplement training or help pilots stay proficient in current, and he can be reached on his Facebook page at Ground Point 9. Jim Hopp, he's a CFI. I wave at him periodically as we pass each other at the ramp at Palo Alto. He teaches at Advantage Aviation and gives tailwheel instruction. Joseph Sheehan flew in the Navy for 8 years and now has a few hundred hours in his new Vision Jet. Josiah Freeman, he flies a Piper Arrow out of Deer Valley, Arizona. And William Birch donates to the show in memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakala with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses. You can read about them at iflyifr.com. Stephen Bush, he's the owner of Lone Star Helicopters in Lago Vista, Texas. He mentions that they do a lot of add-on ratings from fixed-wing to helicopter, and they're at LoneStarHeli.com. John Tosto, he's an attorney from Flint, Michigan, and a member of the Greater Flint Pilots Association and co-owner of a Cherokee 6. Vic Bajaj, who's a local client I fly with in his Cirrus. Mark Holzbach, he lives in southwestern PA. He's a longtime aviation enthusiast who wants to get his private when he retires in a few years. He runs BodandSteel.com, which manufactures industrial fasteners. Tim Crawford, he's a CFI with Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He owns a V-tail Bonanza and runs a company called BrainSpring that helps kids with dyslexia. James Kerr, he owns an SR20. His company makes security screens for protecting your home, and you can find out more at BossSecurityScreens.com. Ed Kelly flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. He says that his son Bennett is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch. Michael Ron, he runs a small wealth management firm in The Woodlands, Texas, which you can find at The Sum, that's S-U-M, thesumplanning.com, and he's thinking of buying a Cirrus. Todd Cussell lives in Arizona and flies an SR-22T. Chris Carnahan, he's president of Boone Valley Forest Products. He flies a V-tail Bonanza out of Spirit Airport in St. Louis. Marlon Dutra works in tech in the Bay Area and flies an SR-20 G6. Richard Clark plans to start instrument training, and he's about 18 months into the build of a Vans RV-14, and he's looking to do first flight of that soon. Greg Campbell is a high-tech entrepreneur from Canada flying a DA-40NG and working on his instrument rating. John Sendak is a hospital executive in the New York metro area. He flies an SR-22 G6 at the Republic Airport on Long Island, and he's currently training for his commercial. Rob Thomas lives near Atlanta and flies a Cessna 182 with a Texas Skyways conversion. Ed Perry lives in Austin, Texas, and flies a 1977 182 out of the Georgetown Airport. Jim Winter flies an SR-20 G3. Lambo Jayabanan, CTO and co-founder of the edtech startup called Knowledge Hook. It's focused on math education from kindergarten through high school. Daniel Maddox, he flies a G36 out of MKC and 18AZ. Jim Gray from Eye Recovery Treatment Centers in Western Canada. John Trowbridge, he's a doc in Humble, Texas, and he flies 4 Air Coupes. Scott Albuquin, he's part owner of an SR-22 and flies out of the Oakland County Airport in Michigan. Dan Morris, he's formerly an Air Force firefighter and currently a cardiovascular ICU nurse, and he uses his GI Bill to work on pilot ratings through Liberty University. Robert Chowdy, he's checking out an SR-20 and is going to be working on his IFR rating. Wesley Shutt. Rick Crockett flies a Cessna 172 XP with a 210 conversion and 29-inch Bush tires. That's got to be some Cessna. And he flies Cirrus aircraft out of Henderson, Nevada, and he's buying a Bonanza F-33A. Arjun Guraj, MD, flies a 2021 Cirrus SR-22 out of the North Las Vegas Airport and has goals to land at every Class Bravo in the U.S. Dan Sweeney, he's a student pilot working on his private in an SR-20 at Mike Goulian Aviation in Bedford, Massachusetts. Sean Murray, he's a private pilot in South Africa who mostly flies a B-55 Baron and R-44 helicopter. Phil, who lives on the West Coast and plans to start instrument training soon. Phil Parham lives in Georgia and working on his instrument rating. Brian Pullman and Jeff Casson, they fly out of Morristown, New Jersey, and they're partners in Business Compliance Services, which specializes in fingerprinting services for the gaming, sports betting, and financial industries. Carson Stilson, who started an aviation wearables brand called Wearworthy, that's W-A-I-R, Worthy. Their first product is a high-end flight bag, and you can find out more at wearworthy.com. Arturo Guerrera, who just passed his instrument, donates in the memory of his son Arturo Jr., and he owns a software company that created a solution for eAPIS called FlashPass. It's available for the iPhone, Android, and web, and you can find out more at flashpass.net. That's helpful if you're flying your plane in and out of the U.S. And Pilot Life Digital Logbook is also a mega supporter. You can find out more about their digital logbook at pilotlife.com. Nick Passmore, he's a student pilot training in a Warrior in Vancouver, Canada. Armin Escajan, he recently purchased a 2019 SR-22T and flies out of Southern California. We have an anonymous donor. And Christy Pottle, she has about 500 hours and is a member of the 99s. She owns a Cessna 182 and a T206 and plans to fly in the Air Race Classic. Jim Brosfield, he's a doctor in Tennessee. Lars Sorsdahl, we talked about his engine-out landing in episode 266. He lives in Norway. Renato Steinberg, he's the founder and CEO of a customizable credit card called Clutch, and Renato said he'll give listeners who sign up a one-time $20 credit if they use the promo code MAX. Their website is clutchcard.com. Tyler Watley, who flies a 172 and has a Cirrus on order. Ron Peterson, who's from Utah. Drew Anderson, he's a doctor in Indiana who's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Shane McFarland, he's the mayor of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and since he flies, he calls himself the Air Mayor. Bill Haug, he flies out of High Sierra Pilots in Carson City and Mendon, Nevada, and he's working on his CFI and hopes to become a father-son flight instruction team. Joey McCormick, he's an insurance agent and ground instructor in Arkansas. If you live in Arkansas or in an adjacent state, call him for a quote on life insurance that covers your private pilot flights. You can check him out at flexiblechoiceinsurance.com. Keith Bowen, Hunter Clark, Peter White, Kimberly Coons, Eric Hines, and William Kinney. My thanks to all of our mega supporters and to everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do, whether it's leaving us a 5-star review on whatever app you're listening to us now, whether it's sending in emails with your questions and feedback on the show, or whether it's supporting the show financially by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around if it don't look right coming down. Don't wait until your side's maybe sliding upside down. You can always